Noted author and Harvard business professor David Garvin has helped everyone from the U.S. Army to LL Bean and Boeing Aircraft to General Electric. He's a world expert at showing these complex organization managers how they can build more effective learning organizations, how they can transfer knowledge, how they can improve both their organization and themselves by acquiring, interpreting, and applying this knowledge. Garvin knows the hands-on tools for kickstarting and sustaining this vital cultural learning process. And Garvin's time-tested and proven methods really work. Now he's even inspiring the wildland fire community with his critical hands-on organizational learning practices and guidelines.
What I want to do here is I want to do 4 or 5 things. The first is I want to provide just a little bit of motivation. Now, we all did learning in school, but why is learning important for your work? Now, what difference does it make to be a learning organization? The second is I want to provide you with a pretty crisp definition. What is a learning organization? And then we can apply it to your own groups. The third, and this is where I want to spend most of the time, is I want to describe to you 6 critical activities that learning organizations do. Things like sharing knowledge across different parts of the organization. And I want to give you lots of practical examples, mostly from companies. That's where we're going to have to apply them, about how these things can be done. Literally stuff you could do Monday when you get back to work. So as practical, as grounded as possible. And then the fourth thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what it means for you to lead learning processes. Because that really becomes part of your jobs if you're going to move the organization forward. And it's a little bit different from the traditional view of leadership. Now, the activity you're engaged in is not a competitive one. But fires are getting bigger and more complex. The only way you can get ahead of them is to learn. To learn from fire activities elsewhere, other regions, perhaps other countries. To share what you've learned on one fire with another group on a related fire. Or even in the course of day-to-day events, find out something done unusually well and quickly pass it on to the next group. And we'll see a lot of this in AARs. I mean, the Army found, for instance, when it was in Bosnia, first group of troops in, quickest thing they found was if you found a snow-covered road without tracks, it typically meant it was mined. You wanted to pass that information around as soon as you could to make sure no other units found it out the hard way. That's learning. There are 3 pieces. The first is leadership. And it's really up to you how you lead learning. Leading learning is different from the traditional model. The second is, do we have the right processes to ask those questions? That's what the AAR is really all about. But the third, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time on in a few minutes, is do we have the right culture? Because not every culture supports active learning. Some of them actually do a pretty good job of dampening or suppressing learning. Learning's got 2 pieces. Actually, it's got 3, but there are 2 of them which you flag, and they're different. The first one is knowing what to do. But you've got a second one, which in many ways is even more important. Doing what we know. We've got the best practice. Okay? This is the problem of finding the best practice, sharing the best practice, figuring out the best way to do something. This is making sure people are actually following through. Learning's got 2 components. It's knowing and doing. And you'll see when I get to the definition, most organizations fail the second test. a lot more than they fail. That's why AARs are so powerful, because they're real-time, quick. What we set out to do, what do we actually do? There's a famous saying in the corporate world that if you don't do anything about it, the urgent drives out the important. I will bet that's even more true in the fire community. The urgent is what's at the top of the list. It's the #1 to-do item. The problem is that's not necessarily the most important thing you've got to do then. Learning is often the most important thing, but it doesn't float to the top. That's got a real practical implication. You got to plan ahead for learning. You've got to build it into certain processes so that it happens by design. And you've got to convince people there's a practical implication here. You know, it didn't take long in Bosnia for people to realize that, we just learned that snow-covered roads without tracks are mined. This was a pretty worthwhile investment of our time. You can do the same thing. And you'll see, by the way, in the way the AAR process works in the Army, they circulate in the field AAR results daily. This is not just about long-term lessons learned. This is also about real-time lessons learned. Because those are the ones where people say, wow, this could have saved a life. Nothing happens toward becoming a learning organization if you don't have a culture that supports and encourages learning. All of us carry mental models. And in particular, the folks who've always been doing it that way are convinced it always should be done that way. Except if technology changes, public exposure and political pressure changes, weather systems do evolve. You often need to change the mental models. And it's one of the reasons why you always need to encourage differing points of view. So there's this reason why you need confidence, but you need a willingness to hear the other side. So that's interpreting. Now, transferring and retaining, we've actually already talked about. If you have an organization where we do something very well in one part of the organization, but the other parts of the organization don't do it equally well, you don't have a learning organization by this test. You have individual pockets of excellence, but if you haven't transferred knowledge, you haven't been able to be a learning organization. Now, let me give you, I'll jump ahead, to talk to you a little bit about why this is so hard to do. Okay? And we're going to make up an example. So let's take, I don't know how you, what's a region or a zone? Could you give me a region or a zone?
Changes from organization to organization, or agency to agency.
Okay. Missoula, Montana. Is that a?
Depends. If it's Forest Service, it's Region 1.
Region 1. Okay. Okay. Region 1. You're from Region 1. Now, I come out and I say to this group, I want you all, what's your name?
Courtney.
Courtney. I want you all to go visit Courtney in Region 1. They have the best record on every single measure we care about in prescribed fires and fire suppression. They're terrific on every count. I want you to go visit and learn from Courtney and her people. How are you feeling about Region 1 right about now? Over my dead body. She can't be all that good. They're hiding something that nobody doesn't know about. Okay? This is the common problem with transferring knowledge. Want all of you go to the mountaintop and learn from the only expert who does anything right in this organization. Prescription for disaster. Even if you're the best there is.
I'm good.
Okay. Now, let me give you the solution to the problem. I actually discovered it at Rank Xerox. It's the British arm of Xerox. It's a brilliant idea. It's simple as all get out. Rank Xerox runs Europe. So they have 9 countries So they put together a team, and they say to the task force, find the best practices on the sales side. One each for every country. And your counterpart would be one each for every region. So this team goes out, and they say, turns out Denmark is the very best at selling small copiers. Turns out France is the very best at selling complicated 4-color copiers. And they document one best practice from each of 9 countries. And then they say to the country managers, the head of the regions, next year, each of you has to adopt 4 practices. We don't care which ones, but you gotta pick 4. Now, what just happened? What did we just do to the problem that we had a few minutes ago?
Gave it ownership.
How do we give it ownership?
By letting them make a decision.
Number one, we gave them choice. You can go to any 4 of the 9. But what happened to this city on the hill problem? How did we solve that problem?
Brought it down.
You disseminated it through different people so that then it wasn't like you have the one all-knowing, and it kind of made everybody else feel like, hey, you know, we did something right too.
Exactly. All of a sudden, everybody's the best at something. All of a sudden, we leveled the playing field. Everybody becomes a teacher, and everybody becomes a student. The problem literally went away. This is a fairly large-scale operation. It cost them $1 million to benchmark everything. In the first year, the net addition to Rank Xerox's sales was $100 million. The year after that, they added an additional $150 million. And it was largely because they gave them choice, and they said, everybody's got something they're good at. All of a sudden, you get the flows in multiple directions. Okay? So that's transferring and retaining knowledge. Purposefully modifying its behavior to reflect new knowledge and insights. Purposely means in pursuit of the organization's goals. That's the important piece here. Learning is not random. We don't send people to classes just because it's fun to take classes or because we have an education requirement. It's got to be clearly aligned with the goals. And the other piece is modifying the behavior. This is doing what we know. Learning organization tries to do 6 things. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time on each of these in turn, but particularly a few of them because they're probably most relevant. First, it collects intelligence about the environment. In a business setting, that means it collects information on customers, competitors, regulatory affairs, social trends. In your setting, it literally means the physical environment. What's the current state of the weather? What's it likely to be? How do we learn more about it? It learns from the best practices of other organizations. So, fancy way of saying benchmarking. And as you'll see, benchmarking is not only within your community, but benchmarking can also be carried out across different kinds of communities. And I'll show you what that means in a few minutes. Most important for our purposes today, a learning organization learns from its own experiences and past history. This is where AARs come in. After-action reviews are no more than a way of saying the past is relevant to what we do today and tomorrow. Most organizations do just the opposite. They sweep the past under the rug. They either declare victory and move on, or they try to keep failures quiet and move on. Both are opportunities for learning. They experiment with new approaches. It's a fancy way of saying they try new things. They encourage systematic problem solving. Now we'll spend some time on the word systematic, because all organizations solve problems. Not all of them do it that carefully. And sixth, and we've already talked a little bit about this, they transfer knowledge throughout the organization. So let's start with the first broad issue. What goes into a learning culture? What are some of the elements of a culture that supports and encourages learning? What were some of your observations? Yes?
Willingness to be criticized.
Terrific. Willingness to be criticized. Why is that important for learning? Should be obvious.
You realize you make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, nobody gets it right the first time, the second time, the third time, all the time. You've got to be willing to accept criticism. What are some other elements of a learning culture? Yes?
I think you have to be willing to accept change.
Willing to accept change.
I mean, it's just not always, the way you've been doing it in the past is not always the right way.
And it's not unrelated to willingness to accept criticism. Somebody may tell you there's new ways and different ways. Yes?
I think not only accept change, but facilitate change and be able to look.
Change, by the way, the link between learning and change should be very clear to you. If the rate of learning isn't greater than or equal to the rate of change, you're flying blind. That's why you need to learn. You'll learn to do new things so the organization can change. Where do mistakes fit into a learning culture? Any of your groups talk about that? Yes, in the back.
We kind of, as a value added to what's been said, we talked about when you make a mistake, what happens. And the word we threw up, the contribution we can make, is trust. How do I, as an employee, how am I sure? And one of our crew members said, we use the term, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears, so something goes wrong and nobody really heard about it or knew about it, why would you say anything about it? But certainly if something did go wrong and it was known, you're going to have to admit it all and that sort of thing. And the trust to where, will I be supported? Will I be ostracized, chastised? That sort of thing. So we thought that trust, and we kind of used trust seems to be the glue that's going to hold a lot of these other things together as we go on.
Okay, so now we got two thoughts here. One is a critical one, which is trust. Trust that your mistake will not be something which you're crucified for. But you want to accept all mistakes in a learning culture? Any and all mistakes? No. What kinds of mistakes do you accept? And what kind of mistakes do you reject? Good decisions come from wisdom, knowledge, and experience. And wisdom, knowledge, and experience most often come from bad decisions. The fact is, we learn the most from our mistakes. They're vivid. You want to make sure those opportunities for learning aren't lost. All right, any other pieces that you want to add to the elements of a learning culture? Okay, let's take the second part. What ones have been most difficult and why? What's getting in the way and what's the toughest pieces for the fire community? Yes, Dave.
Separating standard operating procedure, and I'll talk about mistakes, okay, when they have occurred, what is standard operating procedure and what is room for learning. This was an honest, judgmental error, and there's learning to go on. Because frankly, most people will say, if you lose a prescribed fire or fire use event, it doesn't matter how good that plan looks, how good you've done anything. You burn a house down, you've done something wrong. And I don't know if there's an answer to that, but it's never clear in my mind right now.
So part of the difficulty is how do you avoid the blame culture? The pinning of responsibility. We're going to find a scapegoat somehow. Okay. Is there also a not invented here problem?
Yep.
Which is our region is different from your region?
Oh, yeah.
Our fires are different from your fires. So what could we possibly learn from each other? Okay, first process here is intelligence gathering. All I want you to understand here is there are lots of different ways to gather information on the environment. Search is what you do when somebody says, look it up on the internet. The data is out there. You got to find it. Inquiry is what you do when somebody says, it's in somebody's head. Go ask them the questions. Before they retire, we want to understand what's going on. Observation is needed because sometimes, often for social reasons, people can't or won't tell you the truth, particularly about how they actually make decisions or do their jobs. It means that you've got to collect your information from multiple sources. And you've got to cross-check your findings to make sure they're accurate. Now, this kind of process of gathering intelligence is really easy to do. I want to give you an example of something you could do tomorrow. Okay? Chad Holliday, who runs DuPont, every 2 weeks runs an hour-and-a-half telephone conversation, in his case with managers around the world. It's not a decision-making call. It's an intelligence-gathering call. He runs it like a seminar. So he'll start out and say, okay, what are you folks in Asia hearing about competitive action from Dow? Dow's their major competitor. Oh, they're moving in this area of chemicals. Those of you folks in Europe, are you hearing the same things? Latin America, are we hearing the same things? And he literally goes around the world sharing and comparing insights. I mean, that's why you have daily briefings. There's nothing that says you can't have these kinds of briefings when you're not fighting a fire. In order to stay in touch with weather, conditions, whatever it is you want to track. Because if you have a call once a week or once every 2 weeks, the most you can be behind is once a week or once every 2 weeks. Okay, so that's intelligence gathering. Now I want to say just a word about benchmarking. Benchmarking is the search for industry best practices that will lead to superior performance. You pursue those regardless of where they exist, in your own company, industry, or outside the industry. Now it turns out there are two approaches to benchmarking. There's one which you probably already use, and there's one which you might consider. The one that you already use is benchmarking as copying. So you find another region, or you go to Australia or Canada, and you visit their firefighting community, and you try to find practices that you can literally pick up, transfer over, and drop in with little or no change. That's a very powerful technique. It's only one approach to benchmarking. There's a second approach, which is benchmarking as a catalyst for creative thinking. Okay, I'll give you my favorite example. It comes from Mobil Oil. Mobil was trying to figure out how to improve the speed and service quality at its gas stations. Who did they benchmark? On speed, they benchmarked Roger Penske's Indianapolis 500 race team. Now, I don't know about you, but I have yet to get in and out of a gas station in 3.7 seconds. Can't do it. Doesn't make any sense. The idea was not to copy the practice. It was to give them food for thought. And in fact, the idea of the speed pass is just a prepaid credit card, actually was developed from the thinking of the speed team. Okay? They even experimented with a dedicated lane just for road warriors with the speed pass. Just like a pit crew, there's a dedicated lane. You can use the process to stimulate ideas. Who did the service team benchmark? They benchmarked the local Ritz-Carlton hotel. Turns out when they train new employees, the Ritz-Carlton takes a week. Obviously, they can't afford a week for new employees at a gas station. But they realized they didn't train them at all. They put in 1 hour of training up front, and they got huge improvements. So think of benchmarking also as a process which you can use to get creative ideas from other worlds, other sectors, other industries. One of the difficulties that you have in some of these reports on escape fires is that they're one-offs. It's hard to learn from one experience. What Boeing did was they compared 3.7 and 4.7, two problems, with 0.7 and 2.7, two successes. The differences jumped out pretty starkly. Second, they rotated the people from the project into line positions. If you're going to do it with staff, make sure they become line. If you're going to do it with line, make sure they get to apply what they've learned. Third, and most important, it comes back to the issue we heard before about trust. If you make this a witch hunt, if you make it a search for the guilty, you will learn nothing. Boeing is fortunate. Airframes are incredibly complex. They rely on lots of systems. It was pretty clear if there were problems with the 3.7 and 4.7, they were due to the systems, far more than they were due to individuals causing problems. They made this a search for systems problems that could be corrected, not individuals who had screwed up. Okay? And finally, cultivate your own learning. If you learn, the people who work for you will learn as well. Now, there are several pieces to this. First, you need to remain open to new perspectives. That's why you're here. But often you need to recognize that you have local biases, regional biases. You need to get yourself out of your traditional comfort zone. Second, recognize your own personal biases. Now, they come in lots of forms. Some people like numbers. Some people like qualitative data. Some people like to work in small groups. Some people like to get information from large groups. It's not right or wrong. It will shape the dynamics, though. You should find people who are complementary to overcompensate for weaknesses. Third, and this is probably the most important on this particular list, as you get higher in the organization, more and more information comes to you pre-processed, already filtered, already digested and organized. There's a huge risk there. You lose touch with what's going on at the grassroots. Literally put yourself back on the line and do it periodically. If you don't, you won't be able to interpret the data. To make sense of the data, you got to expose yourself continually to the unfiltered, the raw material. And finally, and we talked about this before, and this is really, I'm going to skip through this, it is really the appropriate place to end the learning material. Learning's an act of humility. It's an act that says we might not have gotten it exactly right. And as a result, we need to do things a little bit differently next time. Some of you are probably saying this learning organization stuff's pretty complicated. There's a lot of things we have to do. There's got to be some easier way. I got one more story to show you. I don't think there's an easier way. Story about a fellow who's out hiking. He's actually up here in the Rockies. Fairly steep trail, and he slips. He falls off the trail, and as he tumbles down the side of the cliff, he catches onto a little tree, a little twig. And he's dangling off the edge of the cliff, and he shouts, "Help me! Help me! Is there anybody up there?" And all of a sudden, the clouds roll in, and there's lightning, and there's thunder, and a voice comes down, and it says, "I'm up here." The fellow says, help me, who's up there? Voice comes down and it says, it is I, the Lord. The fellow says, help me, Lord, help me. Voice comes down and it says, do you believe? The fellow says, Lord, this is really a very thin twig I'm hanging on to. I believe. Voice comes down and it says, then let go. There's a pause, and the fellow looks up. He says, is there anybody else up there? I'm afraid if you're really serious about organizational learning, there's nobody else up there. It really does require moving on these multiple fronts.
With David Garvin's learning techniques, we can improve the process of disseminating lessons learned throughout the wildland fire community. With your help in creating, acquiring, transferring, and retaining knowledge, we can purposefully modify our behavior and prescribe fire and fire use to reflect new knowledge and insights.